There exists an ancient principle in international economics. You cannot simultaneously claim national sovereignty while allowing foreign bureaucrats to write your national budget. It's a fundamental contradiction, an economic impossibility. For 60 years, Kenya accepted this contradiction. 60 years where the International Monetary Fund dictated terms through structural adjustment programs that devastated the Kenyan economy. But this week, that subordination ended abruptly. President William Ruto made an unprecedented decision: the expulsion of permanent IMF advisors from Kenyan financial institutions. We're not talking about a reduction in diplomatic staff. We're talking about the collapse of an economic control structure that processed annually more than $2.3 billion in conditioned loans. And here's what the corporate media doesn't want you to know. China has already committed $6.5 billion in infrastructure financing without the austerity conditions the IMF always imposes. I worked enough years at the International Monetary Fund to recognize when a client state is breaking its chains, and this is exactly that. We need historical context because this rupture didn't emerge from nowhere. Let's go back to 1963, the year of Kenyan independence. Before the ink dried on independence documents, the IMF and World Bank were already establishing offices in Nairobi. In 1975 came the first structural adjustment program, a $90 million loan that required devaluation of the Kenyan shilling by 23%. That devaluation instantly made imports more expensive, destroying the purchasing power of millions of ordinary Kenyans. But here are the real numbers. The IMF promised that devaluation would stimulate exports and create growth. Instead, Kenya's external debt skyrocketed from $360 million in 1975 to $3.2 billion in 1985, an increase of 789% in one decade. In 1982 came the second structural adjustment program, $500 million conditioned on privatization of 142 state enterprises. The IMF argued that state enterprises were inefficient and that privatization would bring investment and jobs. What actually happened? Kenya Airways was partially privatized in 1986. By 2003, the airline had accumulated losses of $420 million and required a government bailout. Kenya Posts and Telecommunications Corporation was divided and privatized in 1999. 30,000 workers lost their jobs. Services in rural areas collapsed because private companies only wanted profitable urban markets. In 1993 came the most destructive program, IMF conditions that required elimination of subsidies on basic foods and fertilizers. The price of maize, the staple food for 80% of Kenyans, increased by 137% in 18 months. Resulting famines killed approximately 1,200 people, according to documentation from the Kenya Red Cross. But the IMF insisted that subsidies distorted markets and had to be eliminated. Then came 2001, when the IMF forced liberalization of the Kenyan financial sector. Banking regulations were dismantled under pressure from Washington. Result: between 2001 and 2006, 14 Kenyan banks collapsed, wiping out the savings of approximately 800,000 depositors worth $960 million. In 2009, the IMF approved a new bailout program of $588 million. Conditions included 15% cuts in public spending on health and education. The number of Kenyans without access to basic health care increased from 12 million to 19 million in 4 years. Primary school enrollment fell from 82% to 73%. But here's the deepest injustice. While the IMF forced brutal austerity on ordinary Kenyans, it simultaneously lent at interest rates that guaranteed Kenya could never escape the debt cycle. Kenya's external debt in 2000 was $6.8 billion. By 2023, it had reached $78 billion, an increase of 1,047%. Kenya now spends 37% of government revenues just on debt service. That's more than the combined budget for health, education, and agriculture. So what happened this week that finally broke this cycle? What happened is that IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva now faces her worst institutional nightmare: an important African state publicly rejecting the IMF development model and surviving economically. Let's talk concrete numbers. The IMF had 19 permanent advisors embedded in the Kenyan Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank of Kenya, and the National Statistics Office. These weren't temporary consultants. They were officials with daily access to confidential data on fiscal policy, monetary policy, and economic planning. They basically wrote the budgets that the Kenyan parliament then approved. That capacity just evaporated. President Ruto announced that Kenya will no longer seek new IMF programs and that existing advisors must leave the country by the end of March. The United States tried 4 simultaneous strategies to avoid this collapse. First strategy: direct economic threats. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen personally called Ruto, warning that rejecting the IMF would result in isolation from international capital markets. Ruto's response was to immediately announce a currency swap agreement with China for $2 billion, completely bypassing Western capital markets. Second strategy: World Bank pressure. The World Bank, which functions as the IMF's institutional partner, threatened to freeze $3.4 billion in existing development projects in Kenya. China responded with an infrastructure package of $4.6 billion for the standard gauge railway that will connect Nairobi with Kampala. Third strategy: credit rating agencies. Moody's and S&P simultaneously downgraded Kenya's credit rating to junk levels, supposedly due to governance concerns. This happened exactly 3 days after Ruto announced the expulsion of IMF advisors. The coordination wasn't subtle. But here's the critical detail. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates immediately offered combined credit lines of $3 billion at interest rates lower than what the IMF was charging. Fourth strategy: attempting to exploit internal political divisions. The State Department under Antony Blinken intensified contacts with Kenyan opposition figures, supposedly to, quote, promote democracy. The Kenyan Intelligence Service documented 14 meetings between American diplomats and opposition leaders in January. Washington's message was clear: cooperate with the IMF or face Western-backed political instability. Here's the supreme irony. The IMF now needs Kenya more than Kenya needs the IMF. Kenya is the largest economy in East Africa, representing 40% of the East African community's gross domestic product. If Kenya's economic model succeeds without the IMF, the other 40 African states currently operating under IMF programs will watch very closely. The IMF just lost its showcase project in Africa, and you can't declare war on your own banker, but that principle works in reverse. You can't maintain control over a nation that has found alternative financing without your austerity conditions. The United States tried to play both sides for decades, present the IMF as a neutral technical institution while using it as a tool of geopolitical control. The Structural Adjustment Program imposed on Kenya in 1993 required Kenya to eliminate tariffs on American imports. Subsidized American corn flooded Kenyan markets, destroying local farmers who couldn't compete. Kenyan agricultural production fell 22% between 1993 and 2000. Simultaneously, the IMF forced Kenya to open its banking sector to foreign financial institutions. By 2010, American and European banks controlled 43% of Kenyan banking assets, extracting profits that flowed back to New York and London instead of being reinvested in Kenyan development. Now, I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, because this situation validates precisely his analysis of structural power in international relations that he developed at the University of Chicago during decades of meticulous research. Mearsheimer argues that great powers create international institutions not to promote universal principles, but to perpetuate their own dominance. The International Monetary Fund was never a benevolent institution designed to help developing countries. It was created at Bretton Woods in 1944, specifically to maintain a global economic order centered on the US dollar and favorable to Western interests. Voting rights in the IMF are determined by financial contributions. The United States has 17.4% of voting rights, enough to veto any major decision since major decisions require 85% approval. Europe collectively has another 30%. All of Africa has less than 7% of voting power, despite representing 17% of world population. This isn't democratic global governance. It's institutionalized oligarchy. Mearsheimer also wrote extensively about what he calls capture institutions, where international organizations serve to perpetuate power hierarchies rather than challenge them. Every IMF program in Kenya included conditions that benefited Western corporations: privatization that allowed cheap foreign acquisitions, financial liberalization that gave access to Western banks, elimination of tariffs that opened markets for American and European exports. The IMF's language spoke of market efficiency and fiscal discipline, but the reality was systematic wealth extraction. I also want to mention the work of Professor Yash Tandon, who was executive director of the South Center in Geneva. His research documents how IMF structural adjustment programs transferred approximately $400 billion from Africa to Western creditors between 1980 and 2010. This is 4 times the total value of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. But while the Marshall Plan built infrastructure and industrial capacity, the IMF extracted wealth while simultaneously destroying African productive capacity through forced privatization and premature liberalization. Professor Michael Hudson from the University of Missouri has argued that modern external debt functions as what he calls financial colonialism, where direct political control is replaced by control through debt obligations that are structurally impossible to repay. Kenya's debt grew even as Kenya made massive payments because interest rates exceeded economic growth rates, the classic definition of a debt trap. This isn't an accident of bad policies. It's the intentional design of a system created to maintain permanent dependence. This is basic political economy theory, validated by 60 years of Kenyan experience, and it validates decades of academic analysis that Western institutions systematically ignore because it challenges the narrative that the IMF exists to help developing countries. What we're witnessing is the collapse of 2 fundamental pillars of the post-1960 neocolonial economic order. First pillar, the monopoly of the IMF and World Bank over development financing. That monopoly worked for 6 decades because African states had no credible alternatives. If you needed capital to build infrastructure or stabilize your currency, you accepted IMF terms or you didn't get financing. That monopoly is broken. China has lent more than $160 billion to African nations since 2000, more than the World Bank and IMF combined during the same period. But here's the critical difference. Chinese loans finance physical infrastructure, ports, railways, power plants, that actually increase productive capacity. IMF loans come with conditions requiring cuts to government spending on infrastructure. In Kenya specifically, Chinese financing built the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, 472 kilometers completed in 2017, reducing travel time from 12 hours to 4.5 hours. The cost was $3.8 billion. Compare that to IMF programs that spent similar amounts during the same decade, but produced no visible physical infrastructure, only endless reports and well-paid foreign advisors. China also built the Olkaria geothermal plant, 280 megawatts of capacity, the largest in Africa. IMF financing would have required privatizing the Kenyan energy sector and selling it to Western corporations. Second pillar collapsing, the development assistance system that functions as political control. Since 1960, Western nations used aid as a leverage tool. Kenya received approximately $2 billion annually in combined assistance from the United States, United Kingdom, and European Union. But that aid came with conditions. Align with Western foreign policy positions, give Western corporations access to natural resources, maintain Western military bases. Kenya has now calculated that political independence is worth more than $2 billion in conditioned aid, especially when China offers financing without political conditions. Meanwhile, the African Development Bank, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the BRICS New Development Bank are creating alternative financial architecture. The African Development Bank approved $53 billion in projects in 2023. The New Development Bank has lent $32 billion to emerging markets since its launch in 2015. These aren't future plans. They're operational institutions already processing financing volumes that rival the IMF and World Bank. And here's the detail Washington finds terrifying. These alternative institutions don't require the structural adjustment programs that have defined Western development financing for 60 years. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that the transition has already happened. Africa just hasn't fully realized it yet. For 60 years, the IMF had a magic trick. It could create liquidity crises in African countries by denying access to capital markets, then offer itself as the only possible rescuer, but only under terms of brutal austerity. That trick is ending not with a dramatic collapse, but with dozens of defections like Kenya's, where nations calculate that sovereign development with alternative partners beats instance, and in the fact that finally, African states have enough leverage to say no. You are witnessing how the foundations of world economic order are being reorganized, and this time, the reorganization might actually benefit the people who have been paying the price of the previous order for 6 decades.